My name is Michael Schley, and this brief presentation is about Walker Evans, American documentary photographer. I'm going to start off with a couple of quotes. The first from Walker Evans himself. Whether he is an artist or not, the photographer is a joyous sensualist for the simple reason that the eye traffics in feelings, not in thoughts. The second quote is from John Sarkowski, the director of the photography department at the Museum of Art in New York. Evans's work seemed at first almost the antithesis of art. It was puritanically economical, precisely measured, frontal, unemotional, dryly textured, consistently factual, qualities that seemed more appropriate to a bookkeeper's ledger than to art. But in time it became clear that Evans's pictures, however laconic in manner, were immensely rich in expressive content. His work constitutes a personal survey of the interior resources of the American tradition, a survey based on a sensibility that found poetry and complexity where most earlier travelers had found only drab statistics or fairy tales. Evans was born in 1903 in St. Louis, Missouri, graduated Phillips Academy in 1922. He applied to Yale, but was rejected and attended Williams College for 1 year after that. Academic life did not suit him well, so he moved to Paris in 1926 with the intent of becoming a writer. He came back to New York in 1927, got a job in the New York Public Library map room, and took up photography in 1927. He never married, had a variety of relationships with both men and women throughout his life, and died in April 1975 at the age of 71. His photographic career began upon his return to New York from Paris in 1927. The first photographs that he published were of the Brooklyn Bridge and Hart Crane's epic poem, The Bridge, in 1930. We'll see a couple of those in a minute. His early influences included Paul Gratz, who introduced him to the Leica camera, August Sander, and Bernice Abbott, who introduced him to the work of Eugene Atget, which turned out to be hugely important. And he was introduced to the 8x10 view camera by Ralph Steiner, who interestingly specialized in American vernacular photography. In 1933, Evans photographed in Cuba for The Crime of Cuba by Carlton Beals. And then in the spring of 1935, Evans was commissioned by Gifford Cochran, an American industrialist, to photograph antebellum architecture in the American South, which turned out to be important. In September 1935, Evans was hired by the Resettlement Administration for, quote, still photography of general sociological nature, those are Evans's words. Evans did not get along well at the Resettlement Administration. He had trouble turning his photographs over for just editorial use by other people. He was very particular about how his photographies were sequenced and viewed. So in the summer of 1936, Fortune magazine he was assigned to Fortune magazine along with James Agee to report on the lives of 3 tenant farming families in Alabama. Fortune did not care for the work and did not publish it. So Agee and Evans published it themselves in 1941 under the name Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Did not sell particularly well, but they re-released it in 1960 after Evans had achieved a certain amount of fame, and it did extremely well, became a classic American photography book. In 1938, Evans was given a solo show by MoMA in New York. He was the first photographer ever to be given a solo show, and that produced the work Walker Evans' American Photographs, another classic American photograph book. In 1943, Evans went to work as arts critic for Time magazine because there were few photo assignments out there, but became staff photographer for Fortune in 1944. In terms of his photographic work, most historians agree that Evans' best work was done before he became arts critic for Time. During his time at Fortune, he was allowed to document his work with photographs, but this period is noteworthy for Evans as a writer primarily. He retired from Time Incorporated in 1969, took a professorship teaching at Yale. The significance of Walker Evans' work is very difficult to overstate. He was among the originators of the documentary aesthetic in American photography. It can certainly be said that he raised American vernacular photography to the level of fine art. And when you look at who he influenced, it's a staggering list of people because he's acknowledged to have heavily influenced Helen Levitt, Robert Frank, Deanne Arbus, Lee Friedlander, Henri Cartier-Bresson, and Vernon Hillenbecker. This is one of Evans's first photographs he published in 1929 in the book The Bridge. This is another photograph from the same series, and this one, it's interesting and was included here because it shows early on the classic Walker Evans style, straightforward, subject-centered, very, very much deadpan aesthetic. Evans had a sense of humor. This was called Truck and Sign. 1930, Evans did a certain amount of street photography, and I think this one just struck me as amusing. This is one of Evans' iconic photographs. This is another of Evans' best-known photographs. As an example of his juxtaposition of the past and present. A constant theme running through Evans' work is the presence of the past in the present. Note that the signs block the porches of the houses facing the road. Signs can only be read from the road. Note the black eye of Carole Lombard as a symbol of the blight created by the sign. This is a classic Evans composition. Subject is centered in the frame, straightforward at eye level. Very deep depth of focus. Note the tree seen behind the garage. It's very unemotional, objective, very classic Walker Evans. This is an example of Evans' interest in signage. He was always interested in signage and topography. And I also think you can see a certain amount of influence of Eugene Atget in this street scene. Another street scene demonstrating the influence of Eugene Atget and Evans' interest in signage. And this is one of Evans' iconic photographs. You see this a lot all over the place. Classic deadpan aesthetic, very straightforward, centered, very unemotional. I find this photograph very interesting. Evans was always interested in signage, so there you see the signage. But the photograph is interesting for its composition. It's not quintessential Evans. You don't see the subject centered in the frame. What you see is mostly negative space in the frame with the signage just a small part in the lower left. Compositionally, it's really not deadpan, but it's an interesting photograph, slightly different style. Around 1931, Evans began a series of informal portraits, stopping people and asking them to pose. This is a later example of Evans' interest in portraits. And what's interesting here is the use of the tilted horizon. It's sort of a New Visions influence. It's not centered and straight on, like a very objective photo. This is another one of Evans' iconic photographs. This is the wife and mother of the Burroughs family that Evans and Agee lived with in Alabama for several months when they were documenting the lives of tenant farmers in Alabama. This is Floyd and Lucille Burroughs, this is the husband of Allie Mae and her younger daughter. Most of Evans' documentary work was done with a large format 8x10 view camera, but Evans made a number of photographs on the street experimenting with the 35mm Leica. This is one of those. And finally, this to me is the quintessential Evans photograph. The deadpan aesthetic, straightforward, centered subject, eye level, very unemotional, very objective. Probably shot with an 8x10 view camera, given the depth of focus. This to me is really Walker Evans at his very best. Thank you for listening.